Now to a battle brewing between two neighbors that could upend the tourism industry here in the U.S.
The U.S. job market is facing its toughest year, with layoffs climbing to a 5-year high. A new report shows that more than 1 million Americans.
In just 12 months, the United States has seen more than $5.7 billion United States dollars vanish from cross-border tourism spending, exports to Canada plunge by tens of billions, and over 1,170,000 American jobs placed on layoff lists, all while a single trade relationship quietly fractured under the weight of a deepening trade war. This is not a distant geopolitical dispute. It is a measurable economic shock unfolding between the United States and Canada, two countries that once shared the most integrated trading relationship on Earth. The critical question is no longer whether this trade war is real. The data confirms it is. The question now is who is actually absorbing the cost, and whether Washington fully anticipated the economic ripple effects now spreading through American communities. And before you assume this story ends with tariffs and trade balances, stay with it, because by the end, we will uncover a lesser-known consequence of this confrontation that could shock even seasoned observers of the United States economy. Within a single calendar year of intensified trade war measures, exports from the United States to Canada in several consumer-facing sectors collapsed at a speed rarely seen between advanced economies. Shipments of American-produced spirits, wine, and agricultural products experienced year-over-year declines measured not in single digits, but in multiples. Entire distribution contracts were canceled, warehouses sat idle, production schedules were cut back or suspended. Tourism data reveals an equally severe picture. Canadian travelers historically represented more than 1/4 of all international visitors to the United States. That inflow was not symbolic. It sustained hotels, restaurants, ski towns, rental car companies, border retailers, and seasonal employment across multiple states. When Canadian travel declined, the loss was immediate and geographically concentrated. Border regions absorbed the shock first, but the effects quickly spread into national service sector data. At the same time, Canadian consumer behavior shifted decisively. Retailers adjusted inventory strategies, importers restructured supply chains. Products once sourced from the United States were replaced with domestic alternatives or imports from other markets. These were not temporary substitutions driven by price volatility. They were long-term contractual decisions designed to reduce future exposure to American trade policy risk. From Washington's perspective, tariffs were intended to raise leverage and protect domestic production. Instead, they triggered a second-order reaction, the erosion of a dependable export market that had taken decades to build. Once trust in supply continuity weakens, it does not automatically return when tariffs are lifted. Meanwhile, labor market data inside the United States shows mounting stress. Corporate layoff announcements surged across sectors tied directly and indirectly to cross-border trade. Logistics, retail distribution, hospitality, and manufacturing all reported workforce reductions. The cumulative effect has been to quietly transfer economic strain from policy headlines into household balance sheets. This is the stage of a trade war that rarely receives attention, the moment when lost trade flows turn into lost jobs, and lost jobs begin to influence political stability. The most severe consequences of this trade war are not found in tariff schedules or trade balance tables. They are unfolding quietly across the United States labor market, where the economic strain triggered by disrupted trade with Canada is increasingly borne by workers rather than policymakers. By late 2025, layoff announcements across the United States exceeded 1,170,000 positions, representing a dramatic year-over-year increase. While no single termination notice explicitly cited Canada, the sectoral pattern tells a clear story. Industries most exposed to Canadian demand, hospitality, food and beverage production, logistics, cross-border retail, and transportation were disproportionately affected. Tourism-dependent regions illustrate this dynamic with painful clarity. Canadian travelers historically filled hotels, ski resorts, restaurants, and retail outlets across northern states and winter destinations alike. When that flow weakened, businesses faced immediate revenue shortfalls. Seasonal workers were released first, then full-time staff followed. Entire communities built around predictable Canadian demand began confronting shrinking tax bases and declining local employment. Manufacturing felt a parallel shock. American producers who relied on Canada as a stable, high-volume export market suddenly faced inventory overhangs and canceled orders. Production slowdowns translated into reduced shifts, temporary closures, and permanent job losses. For workers, this was not an abstract trade war debate. It was the sudden disappearance of overtime hours, health coverage, and household stability. Crucially, these job losses did not coincide with any measurable surge in replacement employment. The assumption that tariffs would stimulate domestic hiring has so far failed to materialize at scale. Instead, labor displacement has outpaced job creation, raising a difficult question. If the United States is losing export access faster than it is gaining protected production, who is this trade war actually protecting? And this pressure does not stop with employment. Reduced income feeds directly into lower consumer spending, higher household debt, and growing dependence on social support systems. The longer the trade war persists, the more it embeds itself into the economic lives of ordinary Americans. While American workers absorb mounting losses, Canada has been executing a less visible but highly consequential transformation. Rather than escalating the trade war rhetorically, Canadian consumers and businesses have altered spending patterns in ways that redirect billions away from the United States economy. Canadian households reduced discretionary travel to the United States, choosing domestic destinations or alternative international markets. That decision alone removed billions in annual spending from American service industries. Unlike tariff-driven price changes, this shift is psychological as well as economic. Once consumers break habitual travel patterns, they do not automatically return when conditions normalize. Retail purchasing followed the same trajectory. Canadian importers and grocery chains adjusted sourcing strategies to avoid exposure to unpredictable tariffs. American suppliers were replaced, not temporarily, but contractually. Mexico, Europe, and domestic Canadian producers filled the gap. Supply chains were redesigned with resilience rather than price efficiency as the priority. This is a critical distinction. Trade flows interrupted by tariffs can recover. Supply chains rebuilt for risk avoidance rarely revert. Every new logistics contract signed outside the United States represents a long-term loss of market share that no future policy reversal can easily reclaim. From a macroeconomic perspective, the effect is stark. Capital that once circulated through American industries now reinforces Canadian domestic growth or strengthens third country partners. The United States is not merely losing sales. It is losing relevance within a neighboring economy that once functioned as its most reliable external customer. This creates a feedback loop. Reduced exports weaken American firms. Weaker firms cut costs and labor. Reduced employment suppresses domestic demand. Meanwhile, Canada's reduced dependence lowers its vulnerability to future pressure from Washington. The most troubling implication is that this dynamic is unfolding without dramatic headlines. No single announcement marks the moment of irreversible change. It happens shipment by shipment, contract by contract, vacation by vacation. From the perspective of Washington, the escalation of tariffs against Canada was framed as a necessary assertion of economic sovereignty. The logic was straightforward. Apply pressure, extract concessions, protect domestic industry, and demonstrate resolve to both allies and rivals. In theory, this approach was designed to strengthen the negotiating position of the United States within a broader trade war environment. Canada was never a marginal trading partner. It was one of the most stable, predictable, and integrated markets for American exports. When tariffs disrupted that relationship, the damage did not remain confined to Canadian firms. It rebounded inward. Exporters lost scale. Distributors lost volume certainty. Service industries lost customers who had been embedded in their business models for decades. What makes this breakdown especially dangerous is that it occurred without a clear off-ramp. Tariffs were imposed rapidly, but no comprehensive strategy was articulated for how or when trust would be restored. As a result, Canadian firms and consumers did not wait for clarity. They adapted. An adaptation, once complete, reduces the leverage tariffs were meant to create. For the United States, this introduces a structural weakness. Economic power depends not only on size, but on reliability. When a partner begins to treat American access as uncertain, the United States ceases to function as the default option. That shift undermines influence far beyond the immediate scope of the trade war. Inside Washington, this tension is beginning to surface quietly. Export-dependent industries are pressing for relief. Border state economies are raising alarms. Yet reversing course carries political risk. Admitting miscalculation weakens the narrative of strength that justified the tariffs in the first place. The result is strategic paralysis. Tariffs that continue to inflict economic costs, paired with a reluctance to acknowledge that the intended leverage is slipping away. Internationally, the trade war between the United States and Canada is being studied far more closely than many American observers realize. Other economies are not focused on rhetoric, they are watching outcomes. Canada's response has sent a clear signal to global partners. Diversification is not theoretical, it is actionable. Markets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America have observed how quickly Canada redirected trade flows and consumer demand when access to the United States became unstable. That lesson is being internalized elsewhere. For allies, the implication is unsettling. If a long-standing partner like Canada can face abrupt tariff pressure, then no relationship is immune. This perception encourages preemptive diversification away from the United States, even in the absence of direct conflict. Trade agreements are reconsidered. Supply chains are stress-tested. Political assurances are discounted. For competitors, the message is different but equally consequential. The United States appears increasingly willing to absorb domestic economic pain in pursuit of political objectives. That raises doubts about its consistency as a trade partner and complicates long-term planning for firms that depend on predictable access to American markets. Meanwhile, Canada's standing has quietly improved. By absorbing short-term costs and executing a disciplined economic pivot, it has positioned itself as a resilient, adaptive economy capable of reducing dependence on any single partner. That perception enhances its credibility in future negotiations far beyond the current trade war. The danger for Washington is cumulative. Each instance of redirected trade reduces future bargaining power. Each partner that adjusts away from the United States diminishes its centrality in global commerce. Influence, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. And here lies the most uncomfortable truth. The United States may still believe it controls the trajectory of this trade war, while the rest of the world is already planning for a future in which American economic pressure carries less weight than it once did. What comes next is not simply a matter of tariffs or trade balances. It is a question of long-term strategic positioning and whether the United States is approaching a point where reversal is no longer possible. What distinguishes the current trade war between the United States and Canada from previous disputes is not its intensity, but its direction. Canada is not attempting to overpower Washington. It is methodically reducing exposure, an approach that carries consequences far more durable than retaliation through tariffs alone. Over the past year, Canadian economic behavior has shifted from dependence management to structural redesign. Trade diversification is no longer framed as contingency planning. It has become national economic strategy. Canadian firms are investing in supply chains that minimize vulnerability to United States policy shifts. Long-term contracts are being signed with partners outside North America. Domestic production capacity is expanding in sectors once comfortably reliant on American inputs. This matters because economic power is cumulative. Each incremental reduction in reliance on the United States weakens Washington's ability to influence outcomes through pressure. Canada does not need to win the trade war. It only needs to ensure that future policy decisions in Washington carry diminishing consequences north of the border. From a strategic perspective, this represents a quiet reversal of leverage. For decades, proximity to the United States was Canada's greatest economic risk and its greatest advantage. That calculation is changing. And once an economy reorients itself around resilience rather than access, it rarely returns to old dependencies. The United States, meanwhile, faces a strategic dilemma. Rebuilding trust would require policy stability, predictability, and time commodities that are politically expensive. Maintaining tariffs preserves domestic political narratives but accelerates the erosion of economic influence. Either path carries cost, but only one risks permanent loss of relevance. This is where trade wars become generational. Decisions made today shape market structures for decades. And the United States may already be discovering that economic dominance, once assumed, cannot be reasserted simply by lifting tariffs. The true risk embedded in this trade war is not declining exports, lost tourism revenue, or even rising layoffs. It is the precedent now forming in plain sight. If Canada, long considered one of the most economically integrated and politically aligned partners of the United States, can successfully absorb tariff pressure and reorient its economy, other nations are taking notes. Not rhetorically, practically. What emerges is a world in which access to the United States market is no longer viewed as indispensable. Instead, it becomes conditional, volatile, and politically contingent. That perception encourages hedging behavior across global trade networks. Firms diversify earlier. Governments plan for decoupling sooner. American leverage weakens before it is ever deployed. This is the moment when trade wars stop being tactical and become systemic. For the United States, the danger is not that Canada retaliates harder. It is that Canada no longer needs to retaliate at all. Economic independence removes the necessity for confrontation. Influence dissolves quietly, without a final negotiation or formal resolution. And here's the shock. Once that transition is complete, no future administration, regardless of ideology, can easily reverse it. Markets remember instability longer than they remember tariffs. Trust, once fractured, is not restored by declarations or press conferences. The United States may soon find itself facing a paradox. It retains immense economic scale, yet commands less automatic compliance. It possesses power, but must now expend more of it to achieve the same outcomes. And that raises a final, unsettling question, one that goes far beyond Canada. If this trade war has revealed how quickly a close ally can reduce dependence on the United States, what happens when far larger economies decide to do the same? The evidence is now difficult to dismiss. This trade war has moved far beyond tariffs and political messaging. It has entered a phase where structural economic behavior is changing on both sides of the border. Canada is no longer reacting. It is recalibrating. And the United States is absorbing costs that were never fully modeled when these tariffs were first imposed. What makes this moment historically significant is not who appears to be winning today, but what is being lost tomorrow. Markets adjust faster than governments. Consumers adapt faster than policy frameworks. Once trust erodes, it is replaced not with anger, but with alternatives. That is the most dangerous outcome of any trade war. For the United States, the lesson is uncomfortable. Economic power depends not only on size or strength, but on reliability. When a long-standing partner like Canada restructures trade, travel, and supply chains away from American dependence, the implications extend far beyond one bilateral dispute. This is not about pride or politics or even short-term economic pain. It is about whether the United States can maintain its position as a predictable anchor of global commerce in an era increasingly shaped by uncertainty. And here's the final question, one that policymakers may be asking behind closed doors, but rarely say aloud. Is this trade war a bold strategy that will ultimately strengthen the United States, or a risky mistake whose real consequences will only become visible years from now? Listen carefully to the data. because the answer may already be unfolding quietly, contract by contract, market by market,